From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus, the podcast of the Middle East Institute. I'm Fadi Nassar, your host, and US-Lebanon Fellow at MEI, the Director of the Institute of Social Justice and Conflict Resolution, and Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at the Lebanese American University. Today, we have the distinct honor of delving into the intricate world of diplomacy with Ambassador David Hale, whose new book, American Diplomacy Toward Lebanon, Lessons in Foreign Policy in the Middle East, offers a compelling exploration of 6 pivotal moments in the history of the US-Lebanon relationship, starting from the country's independence till 2023. Through an individual and collective analysis of these episodes, Ambassador Hale provides invaluable insights into the factors that shaped U.S. decision-making, the implications of these decisions, and the broader context of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. Drawing from a wealth of diplomatic records, primary sources, and scholarly research, Ambassador Hale's book serves as an indispensable resource for anyone interested in diplomatic history, Lebanon, the Middle East, and U.S. foreign policy. Today, we're privileged to have Ambassador Hale with us, whose illustrious career spans decades and continents. Ambassador Hale, who is currently a Global Fellow at the Wilson Center, the lifetime rank of Career Ambassador, held key diplomatic positions such as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Ambassador to Pakistan, Lebanon, and Jordan, as well as Special Envoy for Middle East Peace and Deputy Special Envoy. His extensive background in diplomacy, particularly in the Middle East and South Asia, enriches both his book and our discussion today. Ambassador Hale's journey in diplomacy has taken him across continents, with significant posts in Tunisia, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and the United Nations. In Washington, he has held key positions such as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Israel, Egypt, and the Levant, and Director for Israel-Palestinian Affairs. As a testament to his rich and diverse experience in both Washington and the Middle East, Ambassador Hale's book underscores the paramount importance of policymakers appreciating and comprehensively understanding the intricate dynamics of the local, regional, and international contexts. However, it also emphasizes a crucial point: the significance of decision-makers themselves, their individual personalities, and their nuanced interpretations of these contexts. This dual emphasis highlights that effective diplomacy is not only about understanding the complexities of the situation, but also about the unique perspectives and insights that leaders bring to the table. Importantly, the book challenges the notion that critical decisions are inevitable, asserting instead that they are shaped by a series of choices, some wise, some flawed, that influence outcomes and shape the course of history. Ambassador Hale, thank you for joining us. It's an honor to have you here.
Well, thank you, Fadi. The honor's mine. I look forward to our conversation.
Ambassador Hale, your book begins by diving into an often overlooked period in the US-Lebanon relationship, Lebanon's independence. You contend that American diplomacy played a decisive role in not only recognizing Lebanese independence, but ensuring the country gained true sovereignty. That alignment with the popular mood in the Levant opposed French and former colonial efforts to secure a privileged position. Moreover, you argue that this stance was largely driven to preclude Soviet exploitation, support the new UN world order that FDR hoped would avoid future world wars, and the open-door market access that America sought for its citizens. Reflecting on these historical dynamics in the context of 2024, a period marked by ongoing discussions on global power rivalry, how is the U.S. thinking about the world order today, its role in it, and where would the Middle East and Lebanon fit in all of this?
Well, thanks, Fadi. Obviously, there's been a long passage of time since Lebanon's independence over 70 years ago, but that was really a critical moment. A very famous American ambassador, Raymond Hare, who had multiple jobs in the 40s and the 50s throughout the Middle East, defined the end of World War II as the Great Divide. Before that, the United States had not really been very engaged in the Middle East. We deferred to the colonial powers, particularly the UK and France. And we had obviously some commercial interests. We had missionaries, educators, philanthropists there, but we weren't really projecting our power because we weren't a global power at that stage. As World War II came to its end, we realized we were a global power, and suddenly the Middle East mattered a great deal to our future and the future of our friends and allies around the world. And that was a moment when FDR, as president, really was committed to true independence for the former colonies of Europe, including those of our allies. I kind of brought Winston Churchill reluctantly to agree in something called the Atlantic Charter. They were meeting on a U.S. naval vessel off the Newfoundland coast. And in that Atlantic Charter, a number of principles, including that there would be a commitment to the independence of places like Lebanon and Syria, and also Britain's colonies. And it turned out Lebanon and Syria were the first test case for this because it was a very complicated situation on the ground between the Vichy French, who were aligned with Nazi Germany, the Free French, who were just rising but didn't have troops there, the British, who had troops there, and United States ideals and a vision for the future, yet we did not have soldiers on the ground. And it became apparent pretty quickly that the French were not that serious about independence. They wanted to give the Lebanese the veneer of it, but not the reality. And as you mentioned, our ambassador there, who had a long background in Lebanon, really pushed hard in our system to make sure that we put the pressure on de Gaulle to make sure that he followed through. And we did. And that was a key moment where we worked behind the scenes and our ideals and our rhetoric and our actions all matched up. When you fast forward to today, obviously it's a much more complicated picture in the Middle East than it was, seemingly anyway, in hindsight back then. And instead of just rival global powers, which are, of course, a factor of the United States and the Russian Federation and the Communist China, all vying for influence or at least allies in the Middle East, access to the markets there. We also have rising regional powers like Iran. Iran's been historically very important and even predominant power in the Middle East for millennia. But now today we find that we and Iran are at loggerheads time and time again. And this unfortunately colors much of what we're doing in the region today. And unfortunately, I see what we're encountering now with the conflict that's so multifaceted between Israel, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Iranians as something that we have to figure out how to match our ideals and our rhetoric, certainly the humanitarian issues, the aspirations of the Palestinian people for their own future state, with the reality that, of course, Iran is exploiting this and trying actually to perpetuate conflict so that we and our allies, including Israel, are constantly on the defensive.
Thank you, Ambassador. And we're certainly going to dive later on into our discussion, hope, into this larger sort of contest in the region. But I wanted to take a step back in the moment because one thing that stood out for me in reading your book is the role of leaders and personalities inside the diplomatic corps, from U.S. envoys to ambassadors, in shaping policies and approaches to Lebanon. What are some lessons learned you can share with us, both as a scholar and a former ambassador, for what makes for good tradecraft on Lebanon and the Middle East?
Well, there are a number of factors. One is, as you said, personalities matter. And so we have to have always in mind a need for the most talented diplomats to be on the ground and to be present, not to come and go, to develop the relationships needed to really understand what's happening in a foreign society, particularly one as complex as Lebanon, and then also to be able to exercise influence because you've built up relationships of trust. I mean, I'll give you an example. When President Eisenhower wanted to resolve a conflict inside Lebanon that had been fueled partly by Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, and so it turned into its kind of Western Arab conflict, and he feared there would be a Soviet angle that would support the Egyptians. He sent 14,000 Marines, but he also sent a diplomat. And when the diplomat arrived the day after the Marines, he went and met with the opposition, who were mostly the elite Muslim and Druze leaders and the families that you all know of today. And they were very suspicious of him because they thought that these 14,000 Marines were going to force a solution down their throats. Now, he'd never been to Lebanon. He was Under Secretary of State, a job I held, and had been very close to Eisenhower. But he was a very professional diplomat, and he was able very quickly to resolve the anxieties of the opposition by telling them, we're not here to jam a solution down your throats. In that case, it was whether or not to extend the term of the current Maronite president, Camille Chamoun. We don't have that agenda. What we want is to end this conflict so that you're able to live in peace and outsiders are not exploiting it. And through his calm approach and his listening brief and willingness to be flexible, he actually, as I said, was able to win over the opposition to understand the United States was not there to use these Marines to bring about our solution, but rather to help facilitate their solution. And that's, in fact, exactly what he did. The outcome actually wasn't very far from where Gamal Abdel Nasser himself stood on a resolution of the Lebanon crisis, because in part we were working behind the scenes. Our ambassador in Cairo at the time was Ambassador Hare, who I mentioned earlier. And he was trying to develop from Nasser, what is it that would help you get out of Lebanon? And so that was the approach that we wound up with. And it was very successful, very personal diplomacy. And one of the key elements of that was when Murphy was asked to go out, he had no forewarning that Eisenhower would ask him to go. He just was told to get on a plane, and he went to the Oval Office and said, asked, what are my instructions before I fly off? And Eisenhower said, do the right thing for America. And that was the extent of his instructions. Now, any of us who work in the Foreign Service, the State Department today, none of us would get such simple instructions, maybe for a good reason. But if you trust your people on the ground, it's good to give them enough maneuvering room that they can actually produce outcomes, because diplomacy usually requires some give and take.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, I want to build on that example that you just shared with us, because one of my favorite chapters was on the landing of U.S. forces in Lebanon in 1958. While doing well to present both Eisenhower's personal reflections as well as critiques of his decision-making, you highlight that this decision was ultimately shaped by Eisenhower's larger purpose of ending the erosion of Western influence in the Middle East by asserting American power in a place and way that made victory a near certainty. The historians listening will likely hope I ask you to draw on your reading of the differences between Eisenhower's approach and Reagan's, while those with their eyes on the future of U.S. presence in the Middle East would likely benefit from your reading on the opportunities and limitations of the use of American power in maintaining its credibility in the region and beyond at a time when the U.S. order in the Middle East and globally is increasingly challenged.
Well, there's nothing like success. And so one of the reasons that Ike was able to look back on that is one of the great moments of his presidency. He spends a lot of pages in his memoirs on it, is the fact that the outcome was exactly what he wanted it to be, which was a reassertion of America's relevance to the Middle East. He was worried that the Soviets, of course, we were locked in a global Cold War at that time. He was worried that the Soviets, who were not really present in Lebanon at all, would somehow take advantage of any gains that the Arab nationalist movement was able to achieve in Lebanon. So it became, in Eisenhower's mind, this larger global conflict, whereas in the minds, I think, of most of the Lebanese, it was a much more localized affair. There was the conflict between the opponents and the allies of Camille Chamoun, which tended to fall on a Christian-Muslim line, although not entirely. Then there was the regional dimension in which the Arab nationalists were pushing harder and harder against the monarchies and the more conservative regimes like Chamoun's. And that was where Eisenhower saw the erosion of American power, and that he felt inevitably, even if the Soviets weren't behind it, they would take advantage of it. Now, he fudged a bit in his public presentations to the American public and the world in claiming that the Soviets really were behind it, when in fact they really weren't. Nassar was deeply involved, and even though denied it, the fact is, if you look at, for example, the excellent biography of Jag Hammarskjöld, who was Secretary General of the UN, Hammarskjöld maintained publicly that the Egyptians were not involved, but privately, after just spending a day in Lebanon, he flew to Cairo and told Nassar to cut it out. He knew what was going on. And so more and more pressure was being placed on Nassar to kind of draw back. And with that assertion of the power of 14,000 Marines, Ike was able to show that we did matter. But one thing that was interesting, and this comes to your point about contrasting this with the Reagan experience in the 80s, is that so many levels where our government seemed to function better in 1958 than it did in 1982-84 period. For one thing, Eisenhower was very hands-on. He had already mentally sort of shaped his attitude and his approach to this problem months before the actual deployment of the Marines. And as having been the commander of our European forces and having been the great, of course, hero in leading the D-Day invasion and the successful end of World War II in Europe, he had enormous experience and credibility. And so he didn't go through a lot of interagency meetings, a lot of hand-wringing in the White House. There were just two primary meetings in the run-up to the landing of our Marines in Beirut. And he'd already made up his mind. It's clear from the record. He just wanted to kind of make sure everyone was on board and the plan made sense. The other interesting thing was it was a much more disciplined time, because I could find no real record of any infighting, any undermining of the president's strategy, any back channels from the White House undercutting the State Department or the military or vice versa. When you look at the record in 82, 84, it is full of that. We can go into more detail on what actually was happening, but Reagan sent in 1,400 Marines to extricate Israel from an operation that clearly had overreached the objective realities of what Israel could do through military means in trying to evict the PLO and Yasser Arafat from Lebanon. And there was a terrible standoff, humanitarian crisis, very reminiscent of what we're seeing today in Gaza, was happening in Beirut. And Reagan decided he had to send in these Marines on the advice of his main diplomat, Philip Habib, a Lebanese American, by the way, also Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, who said, look, we can come up with a plan, but we have to have American and other international troops to sort of be the buffer between the Israelis and the PLO as Arafat evacuates Beirut. So we sent the Marines in. They got pinned down later for reasons we can go into, but our team had to negotiate what the Israelis wanted, which was basically a normalization treaty between Israel and Lebanon. And the United States embraced that as a goal. But again, we had difficulties with it. And we found that throughout this process, there were back channels between the White House and the Israelis undercutting our diplomat on the ground, Philip Habib. Phil Habib would constantly come up against the fact that, from the Israelis, we're hearing something else from Washington. They're telling us to keep fighting. Whereas Phil Habib's mandate from Reagan, he was talking directly to him, was, no, we want this to come to an end. We want it to end soon. So there were gremlins in the system, very, more conservative. People call them neocons now. I wouldn't know what you'd call them in the early 80s, but people who felt that they were speaking for the president, but really weren't. But since they sat at the White House, their message was one that was very in line with Israeli thinking. The Israelis took that as the marching orders and undercut Phil Habib very much that way.
And looking towards the present, the second part of the question, this question on the opportunities and limitations of the use of American power in maintaining credibility in the region. Are there particular lessons learned of both periods, of Eisenhower's and Reagan's, for the present context?
I would say two things leap out to me looking at those two episodes and today. One is that Eisenhower also got in and out fast. The Marines weren't there. They were all gone by October. They landed in the middle of July, and they were all gone by the fall. And everything went back to normal. Of course, we didn't solve any of the underlying problems in Lebanon, which had frankly been the backdrop of this crisis. They came back to haunt Lebanon later. But we resolved that immediate problem, and then we left quickly. And there were only one Marine died, and that was basically kind of an accidental thing. 82, 84, we stayed. We went back in because we pulled the Marines out after a month, or after a few weeks, actually. And then there had been a slaughter in Sabra Shatila. The Israelis were implicated in that. And we felt a moral responsibility to go back because we'd promised the Palestinians, if you remove your soldiers, we'll make sure your civilians are protected. And they weren't. So Reagan felt a moral responsibility to send the troops back. But their mission was very amorphous. It wasn't clear what it is that they were going to be doing. And so they got pinned down, and they wanted to rebuild the state of Lebanon. But because the state at that point was basically just a tiny rump, basically run by a few Maronites and the leadership of the Maronite army, it wasn't viewed really as a national mission. It was viewed as an American association with one faction in Lebanon. So we ended up being a target. And that led, of course, as you know, to the events of Hezbollah becoming a factor and their attacks on the American embassy, the American Marines, when we felt, and rightly so, we were doing, God's work in trying to help Lebanon get back on its feet. We were there as peacemakers. It wasn't always viewed that way by everybody else because of who we were working with. And so I think if you look at today, it's important for us to remember that any solutions have to be really tailored to a number of different audiences, and they have to be accepted by a wide spectrum of a society, or ultimately they will become, those of us who are trying to bring about a solution could become a target of our own. The other thing I would note is that we tend to usually not tell the Israelis how to conduct war, but rather how to conduct their peace. In other words, once they've accomplished whatever it is they think they're accomplishing or reach a dead end in their military campaign, that's the moment when the United States needs to be very nimble and say, well, here is an alternative approach to get you out of this fix that involves diplomacy and political compromises, because a foreign army is not going to be able to come up with political solutions in an Arab country. It's going to have to come partly from within. And that was a lesson that we learned the hard way in Lebanon, and I hope we can continue to carry that in our minds as we approach the problems we face today.
You lead me to sort of ask up this follow question. You write that American administrations should attach no more importance to Lebanon than it deserves, yet stress that neglect brings about high costs. I have to ask, what does the right amount of importance look like to you?
Well, that's a perfectly good question. What I was trying to convey was that Lebanon is too often, perhaps, but the reality is it is viewed from Washington, usually through the prism of something else that's going on in the region. So our officials here don't always look at Lebanon, but rather as a neighbor of Israel or a neighbor of Syria, as a country where basically it's sort of a landscape where our allies and our rivals are battling each other out, and we may want to take sides. I remember there's a quote I found of Jimmy Carter, who was having dinner with Anwar Sadat at Camp David. They were waiting for Menachem Begin to make up his mind about something. And so just the two of them were having dinner. And I think to make conversation, Sadat asked, what's your thinking, Mr. President, about Lebanon, which was going through one of its periodic crises. And Carter stopped and he said, we don't really think about Lebanon as Lebanon. We're too busy trying to deal with whatever the crisis is and keep it from spilling over and affecting the other things we're trying to work on. And we never really addressed Lebanon as Lebanon. And I think that summed up, in a way, one of the problems of U.S. policy is that because Lebanon isn't as significant as Saudi Arabia with all its energy wealth, or as Israel, given its close relationship to the United States, or Iran, given its rivalry and its ability to project power, Lebanon is not any of those things. And that's what I meant by we shouldn't attach too much importance to it. But the fact is, it keeps coming back. And keeps coming back because the underlying problems of Lebanon are not resolved. And so we need to be able to stay and be persistent in our approach to Lebanon, not just come and go when the crisis demands an immediate intervention. Short-term intervention could make things worse, as it did in 82, 84. We got our Marines killed and our embassies blown up. We withdrew as fast as you could think it would be possible. And that's the moment when there was about almost number of years where the U.S. really wasn't present, and our opponents, our adversaries, were able to really put their roots down very deeply, and our friends felt abandoned, and so they had to make do for themselves and shift to these new winds of power that were coming from Iran and elsewhere.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I promise to our listeners this isn't a forced advertisement, but your book is timely. Many of the episodes will likely have readers from both Lebanon and the U.S. looking to the past for parallels. Since 2019, Lebanon has been struck by concurrent crises, a presidential vacuum, a localized but intensifying conflict between Hezbollah and Israel, a devastating economic meltdown, the Port of Beirut blast, and a refugee crisis. In the US, we see a new ambassador to Lebanon, a special envoy, and we're entering an election year. One very interesting finding you highlight in your book is the consequences of the 1996 ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel. I was hoping you can help introduce our audience that may not be too familiar with this period on the details of that ceasefire. And with the U.S. currently playing a role in mediating to de-escalate renewed conflict between Hezbollah and Israel, are there any particular lessons learned from the 1996 model?
Absolutely. I'm a big believer in knowing what happened in the past so it can help us prevent repetition of mistakes. 96 was a watershed in many ways because this is a period in which the Clinton administration was very sincerely committed to peace in the Middle East. And they decided, though, that the best way to get there was through a Syria first strategy. And a Syria first strategy in their mind meant that if we can get an agreement on the Golan Heights between Syria and Israel, that would require a peace agreement between them. And that would mean that Syria would have to make a decision as to its alliance with Iran. And we felt, the American administration felt, that it would choose to go down the road of peace and turn their back on the Iranians. But we also knew that the Iranians, Hezbollah, and Syria had their grips on Lebanon. And the administration decided that they would give us basically free rein in Lebanon. Again, I was able to find very easily quotes from the memoirs, particularly Martin Indyk, who was Assistant Secretary of State at the time, who said, basically, we asked Assad, how are you going to take care of Hezbollah? He said, don't worry, I'll take care of it. And we never really tested what he meant by that. And Indyk actually said, we wanted Syria to keep their troops in Lebanon, even though our rhetorical position was the opposite, because of the Taif agreement and so forth, that had brought an end to the civil war in Lebanon. It called for the withdrawal of all foreign forces, and that meant Syria and Israel from Lebanon. In fact, Martin said, we wanted the Syrian troops to remain there because no one else would be able to deal with and disarm Hezbollah in the context of an Israeli-Syrian peace. So we rather cynically, although you can understand why, but rather cynically decided to let Assad have his way in Lebanon in the expectation that eventually things would turn out all right. Unfortunately, Assad never agreed to any of the offers that were made. So for 8 years, we chased after Assad, but he consolidated his position through Hezbollah and other tools in Lebanon. And he also, I think, as did the Iranians, they used a spigot of violence from Lebanon into Israel to try to influence the political equation and the negotiations. So there were two major episodes in which fighting between Israel and Hezbollah spiked into the uncontrollable and required our Secretary of State to put everything aside and negotiate an outcome. The second of those episodes was the one you mentioned, 1996. And what we were doing, we're negotiating with Hezbollah indirectly and thereby legitimizing their role. And we weren't negotiating with the Lebanese government. We were negotiating indirectly with Hezbollah. And we came up with this arrangement that did bring calm. It's called the Israel-Lebanon Monitoring Group, but it validated up to certain red lines, a level of violence between Israel and Hezbollah, which basically said Hezbollah can do certain acts and Israel can retaliate in certain ways, but it has to be all contained within certain red lines. And that was a terrible admission at that point of how weak the United States was, because by having conceded to Assad control of Lebanon, it meant we had to basically accept the rules of the road that were being set by Hezbollah and by Assad's allies. And so it did, in a way, contain things for a little bit, but it also allowed enough pressure to be applied on the IDF that they eventually withdrew from South Lebanon. And that, of course, led to 2001. So the point I make, though, today is that it would be a reversal of the gains we have made with Security Council resolutions 1558 and 1701, which demanded that both sides end violence and both sides respect the border of Lebanon. It would be a reversion to go back to the monitoring group arrangement, because that basically validated a certain level of violence between the two. And the people who paid the highest price, of course, were those living in South Lebanon and northern Israel, the innocent civilians who, as always, are the ones who suffer.
Thank you, Ambassador. In addition to an active conflict, Lebanon is also in the midst of an ongoing presidential vacuum. In your book, you note that when you were ambassador, Washington helped facilitate an opening between Suleyman Frangieh and Saad Hariri. And afterwards, what you describe as an active and indiscreet campaign on behalf of Frangieh. What were the unintended consequences of this approach? And fast forward to today, with Frangieh being the Hezbollah-backed candidate for the presidency. What are some lessons learned?
Well, this is something, there's a crisis every 6 years or so in Lebanon over the presidency. It's a 1-year term, but often presidents feel that they're so indispensable that they need to stay on for a longer period of time. So this is just a recurring theme. And it happened again when I was ambassador, as you mentioned. President Suleyman actually decided to leave on time. He didn't feel he was indispensable. And he knew, in fact, trying to stay would create great disruption and upset in the country. So as the statesman that he was, he said, it's time for me to go. The problem was that the forces of March 14 and March 8, the pro-Western, this is a simplistic variation of this, but pro-Western March 14, more Iranian-oriented March 8, were more or less evenly split in parliament, so neither side could get their way. And the United States, as often in these situations, became very uneasy with the absence of a president. It paralyzed the state of Lebanon. It meant we had really no one to work with on key issues of war and peace in South Lebanon, governance issues, so forth and so on. Syria was inflamed next door. So they became highly agitated and wanted to see this vacancy filled. I wouldn't say at any price, but almost at any price. So I made clear to Washington, well, if that's and by the way, the only person who had any real chance of getting elected eventually was General Michel Aoun. And I had a very good and productive relationship with the general. I didn't have any of the baggage of the past, and I treated him as he should be treated, as a well-known and significant figure in Lebanese politics and society, and also the head of a party that at that point anyway was probably the largest Christian party. He had basically signed an MOU with Hezbollah, and so he was their candidate, which was anathema in Washington. And the idea was, well, what can we do? And I said, well, not much, but the one person who might be able to stand in the way of Michel Aoun would be Suleyman Frangieh, who's also a March 8 ally, but doesn't have an MOU with Hezbollah. He's very close to the Assad family and to the Syrian regime, but well known in Lebanon. And I said, that's probably the best you can do. So we agreed. To my surprise, the Hariri family and the Frangia family had not really any connectivity. And so I did, of course, as an ambassador, you know, people from all different sides. And I asked both if they were willing to get together and talk, and they were. And we had discussions with Frangia about policy. And basically, I ended up saying, you know, if you two want to pursue the candidacy of Suleiman Frangia for president, the United States will not oppose that. That was the extent of the policy. We would not oppose it. And that cleared the decks for Frangia. But we also made clear, I made clear, we would not support you. In other words, we're not going to go around telling our allies in Lebanon that we support this. You guys have to do that. If the Hariri camp and the Frangia camp together can bring about an election, that's something the United States is not going to oppose. But we're not going to support it. We're not going to work for it because, frankly, the heavy burden of the heritage of the Frangias with Assad. And they were able to come up with an agreement. But in the end, also, by the same token, I think people saw what was happening. And Samir Jaja, the leader, of course, of another major Christian party and aligned with the March 14 pro-Western axis, and Aoun came up with their own agreement, which surprised everyone. And that ended up, frankly, being the engine that brought about the election of Michel Aoun as president. And we worked, of course, with the elected president, as you would expect. So one of the lessons I draw from that is, you know, the United States does have some influence, but we shouldn't overdo it. Because as you mentioned, and I write in the book, one of the factors after I left, and it sounds like I'm patting myself on the back, but I was very careful to make sure that we had no public profile on this and people could talk, but I wasn't going around endorsing Frangia. Unfortunately, when I left, the approach shifted by our diplomats and perhaps by Washington, and they became much more aggressive in advocating for Frangia. And I think that's what led partly to the counter reaction. So, you know, it's very important that outside powers not be absent, but we also need to be mindful of Lebanese sovereignty and not try to make decisions for Lebanese that are theirs to make and not ours. We also need to make sure that other foreigners, though, aren't doing what we ourselves want to try to limit ourselves from doing and aren't trying to push people around as well for certain outcomes. Now, the other lesson I learned, I think, over time, not just from these chapters, is that the presidential vacancy is a bad thing, but having the wrong president elected can be worse. And so we shouldn't allow our unease with a vacancy to get us to be so agitated that we stampede our allies into making compromises and choices they would not otherwise make. And this is one of the things I worry about right now is that we've already seen this. We've gone through a period where a number of moderate candidates have been surfaced in the interest of finding a compromise. And they've been shot down by the other side, by the pro-Iranian elements who just sit tight. And this game can go on, you know, ad nauseum while, you know, we just keep offering people up. On the other side, they don't care about the vacancy. They're willing to sit as long as it takes till the moment is right and their own candidate will be accepted because everyone else will be so frustrated by the state of the economy and by the state of the country, partly because of the vacancy. So, you know, my advice is if the Lebanese can come up with an agreement, by all means do it. But in the meantime, we should not be pressing unrealistically for outcomes that frankly are not going to serve our interests or our friends. And right now, I don't see, because of the war in the Middle East going on, I frankly don't see how the presidential issue can be resolved when the Lebanese themselves can't really tell where the power equation in the Middle East is going to rest once this conflict is over. I mean, is the United States going to be up or is Iran going to be up? Who's going to be up and who's going to be down in Lebanon? No one's sure about that. So they're unlikely to make compromises and reveal their bottom line positions in a period of such uncertainty.
Ambassador, I find myself, you know, following up to like every last sentence you share. The thing is, I have a thing for how books begin and end. You end your book with powerful words that really touch on how you've just concluded, you know, your past answer. And I hope this presses our listeners to pick up your book. You'll allow me to quote, "After 1984, Syria and later Iran observed that America, above all, craved avoidance of escalation with them. Episodes of violence related to Lebanon became a certainty. Insecurity and war are born from weakness, not strength. A lesson American policymakers and voters should never forget when determining their options in the Middle East. In 2024, with parts of the region inflamed and the rest on the brink, and the region is back on the minds of voters and campaigns in the US, what is America's best option in the Middle East moving forward?"
Well, it's complex, But building on the point I made in the passage you just quoted, it's really about restoring deterrence. And we and our allies in the Middle East lost our deterrence. And that's why Hamas acted the way it acted on October 7th. It's why Hezbollah joined forces. It's why the Iranians are backing this to the hilt, is because they no longer believed that the United States had the determination, or our friends, the determination to really fight back. And that's unfortunate, because if our deterrence had been intact, we wouldn't have this kind of conflict. We wouldn't be suffering, and our friends and allies wouldn't be suffering this way. We wouldn't have to make these tough decisions if our deterrence had been maintained throughout. And you maintain deterrence by never allowing the other side to feel there's an opening. And the frustration you kind of hear it behind my voice in that passage is that we tend to look at the proxies of Iran rather than Iran when we are dealing with problems. And it goes right back to the 80s. We never retaliated against the Iranian forces in Lebanon because of their behavior in supporting Hezbollah's attacks on American forces and American embassies. We never did anything because we didn't want an escalation. We didn't want a war with Iran, but we had a war with their proxies, with Hezbollah. And if the proxies are the only ones paying the price and not the sponsor, not Iran, then, the Iranians will continue until every last proxy is killed. They don't care about the Palestinians or the Lebanese at the end of the day, except as convenient tools. If we're not applying sufficient pain to the sponsor to make them step back, then we are locked forever in these wars of proxies. And so I don't want to sound like a warmonger, but if we don't establish certain lines that can't be crossed, then they're going to keep testing and testing and testing, and people will keep dying. I was struck, and that it was about 6 weeks ago when there was that barrage of drones and missiles against Israel after the Israelis had apparently struck the leadership and the Iranians that were safe havening in their consulate in Damascus. I was struck how quickly the Iranians backed down, because when the conflict's at the state-to-state level, they're obviously at a disadvantage. Their advantages are when it's at the asymmetrical proxy level. They backed down not because they wanted the war to end, but because they wanted the war to continue, but to continue at the level of proxies where they had certain advantages and where they weren't paying the prices. It was Palestinians and Lebanese paying the prices. And so we've got to take that lesson and remember, not that we want to start World War III in the Middle East, but we may end up with, as we are today, with sufficient conflicts that are very hard to end because we weren't paying attention and because we didn't understand the connectivity between the local problems that proxies are exploiting and the overall strategy of the Iranians to manipulate these problems. So when you ask about advice, I would say you got to put the pressure on both the proxies and the sponsors. You have to have localized solutions so that we're, I think, in an honorable and obvious way, trying to deal with Palestinian issues between the Palestinians and the Israelis so that they can live in peace together and the Palestinians eventually can reach their aspirations for sovereignty. But it has to be also linked to the larger picture. Otherwise, the Iranians will continue to spoil any peace initiatives we make. The Iranians know exactly how to spoil them, which is to launch proxy attacks. And we've got to get ahead of that. Right now, the Iranians are setting the agenda for the Middle East, not us. And that is a terrible situation for a great power to be in.
Thank you, Ambassador. As we wrap up this discussion with a last question where I ask you to reflect on if you could add one chapter being U.S. foreign policy to Lebanon and the Middle East since October 2023. As I ask you to reflect on what would the main lesson be, I want to do so keeping in mind something we didn't have enough time to discuss, which is what you call know yourself. There are some deep problems you outline with the U.S.'s own internal approach to crafting foreign policy, whether it is partisanship, siloed bureaucratic approaches that miss out viewing the region as an interconnected theory. So given all that of what you write, know yourself, know your enemies, know your friends, what would be the final main lesson, everything that has happened since October 2023?
Well, I think the main lesson for ourselves is the dangers of partisanship. I mean, one of the reasons we're not able to apply sufficient pressure on Iran to behave differently is because our policy keeps changing. With any change in power in our system, we veer back and forth. We've tried everything in the national security strategy playbook since 1979 with the revolution. We've tried engagement, we've tried maximum pressure, we've tried containment, we've tried negotiation. None of it seems to get what we want. And I think part of it is we're not consistently and persistently applying it over a period of time in which the Iranians can be convinced well, this is what we have to deal with. This is the reality. So whatever strategy we adopt, it has to be tailored in such a fashion that it won't end when whoever's in charge of Congress or the White House changes. And that requires a certain level of bipartisanship, which means you may not get, I'm a hardliner on Iran. I'd love maximum pressure. But if I could get bipartisan support for something that's a little less than maximum pressure, but something the Iranians knew was going to stick with them and they had to respond to, I would take that and bank that. The other problem with ourselves is Americans like to view the world in rational terms. I equate it to the world of John Locke, where, the rule of law and common sense and, enlightened self-interest will always prevail. And people, in the end of the day, given the right opportunities, will do the right thing. And unfortunately, the Middle East is not the land of John Locke right now. It's the land of Thomas Hobbes, where anyone who lives there knows chaos is on their doorstep on any given day, and with real life consequences for their families and for their economies and their livelihoods. And so you gotta, I think, on the part of the United States, you have to be a little realistic about what solutions are likely to actually be able to be adopted and implemented in the Middle East today. So instead of trying to reach for the skies, sometimes incremental steps that may create a better climate and may produce more trust between people may be the way to go, rather than to think that you're going to come up with some comprehensive solution overnight in an environment in which people have just been murdering each other the day before. One last point, which is problems with our friends, which in the case of Lebanon usually boils down to working out with the Israelis what is a realistic strategy for their frustrating world that they live in which proxies can ruin their day any day from the north, their north, Lebanon south. And, we live by a motto that Israel has the right to defend itself by itself, which I fully believe in. But, Israel's not autonomous. It may be autonomous in its decision-making, but it's not autonomous in the consequences of its decisions. So we have to make sure that our Israeli friends understand that, frustrating as the world is around them, the approaches may need to be carefully considered. And particularly the hardest thing for statesmen to do often is to understand when change is required. So when an approach that made sense after October in dealing with Hamas at that point, given what had happened and their instinct to try to eliminate Hamas, was perfectly understandable. Now today, it's a much more complicated environment in which, unfortunately, for the Israelis, they may have to make choices that they wouldn't have made in October, just in order to bring this conflict to an end and try to find a more stable foundation for work on restoring that trust and confidence that is absent in the Middle East today.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for your time, for your insight in this book, and for your service. And thank you to our audience for listening. That's all the time we have for this week. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in, and to our podcast editor, Elliot Sanders, for all of his work on this week's episode. You can find all of MEI's latest coverage of Lebanon and other regional issues on our website at www.mei.edu. And you can follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.